It's a very obvious one. So first of all, let's dissect the meaning of blitzscaling, because we've been mentioning so many times. And you are someone who has worked and seen hiring at various scales. So based on your experience, what is the difference between hiring some, let's say, 10 to 50 people, or let's say 100 to 500 people, and hiring 500 to 5,000 people? How do you think these two things are different?
Well, thank you for that opportunity to come and speak here, Mudit. It's a pleasure to be here on a Sunday evening. Well, yeah, I mean, my recruiting career is about a decade and a half, and largely in the technology space, it's been around the last few years, right from the time you started seeing a lot of startups coming into the bandwagon here, right? In fact, earlier we would know technology hiring only to be, the services companies which would hire a lot of engineers, and that would be largely from campuses and a few laterals that you would hire. But the startup space has kind of revolutionized the way technology hiring has been happening, and that revolution has swept India as well. So if I were to think about these sort of problem statements that companies like Flipkart, Ola, Bounce, and Misho, which were typically startups when I joined them and kind of were scaling, uh, is very very unique in that space, right? I mean, they were looking at solving for very very consumer problems, and therefore these sort of technology folks that they wanted in the companies had to have a certain bar of talent, right? And that has not been in great supply in India, unfortunately, right? Though we kind of churn out almost like a million engineers a year, um, we've struggled in the space of high caliber technologists. Largely this technology piece goes into further studies, or they go abroad for other opportunities and stuff, and some of them of course work in governmental organization and stuff, but their outlook towards private sector companies was fairly low, right? Well, startups revolutionized it. So when we were hiring initially, the concept of figuring out the lateral talent, which was typically into various tech stacks and in data sciences or in AI and ML related areas, one of the biggest thing was to even figure out how to recruit them, because even the recruiters did not have the experience then to recruit these folks, right? So if I were to look back in time, when we were scaling from, like you said, the initial part of the business, right, and setting up the first set of engineers, right, and I remember this even doing way back in 2005 8, when some of the startups based in Silicon Valley would actually set up their technology or their R&D teams here in India. Then would be to figure out the sort of folks who will understand this technology to be able to have the right conversation with these folks, right? Because you're talking about an engineering subject which was fairly advanced, and the sort of engineering work that we would then do in India were typically back office and typically services related. So that conversations, the scale of conversation itself moved, and therefore it was important to identify the right technology hiring teams, and you need to get that done first, right? So when you are initially setting up any startups, the first thing to do is to identify the set of right recruiters, uh, build that build that team which is enabled to figure out where these engineers are. How do we start the conversation with them? What is the line of conversation and stuff? Then you come to the process of hiring, right? I mean, what is your bar of talent? What sort of companies are you benchmarking your sort of problem statements with? Which other companies or which other sort of folks in this area have worked on similar scale and similar lines, and therefore you try and attract them, and therefore that conversation through selection processes, so you build that entire recruiting engine to be able to run through that. Then you come to the part of differentiating in terms of how do you bring about the storyline for your startup, right? I mean, what is it unique that you're bringing onto the table, and why is it that an engineer at that scale needs to come and work with you? So these would be the usual conversation that would happen by by understanding the core of the business, and communicating that to these engineers who are trying to apply to you and stuff. So the first couple of years goes in terms of setting this up, and not today you don't have the luxury of a couple of years, you have a luxury of a few quarters to do this, right? Because by the time you would have reached some scale, In the last 2 3 4 years, you've seen the sort of investments that have come into the startup space, and therefore many of these companies have started, booming in scale, right? So then you quickly try to move from what is your initial 10 20 engineers to 20 30 plus engineers, and then there is a different ball game also that sets in. So then it is no longer about team and processes, but it is more about creating a differentiation, talking the right storyline, talking about your employee successes and how you are creating an impact by doing that particular business. Because eventually, engineers today look beyond what they do during that day's work, right? They also want to see what is the impact uh, of their work on the society, on social causes, and so on. So for us in Misho, for example, one of the things that is, like you correctly pointed out, one of the things we are impacting is 100 million plus resellers, right? To a sort of a target segment which had not had the access of applying technology to their business practices. So that sort of a impact has been able to be called out, and that's the differentiation which has been able for us to be a success factor to get to this sort of a scale. When I joined about a year back, almost like a year back, almost around a year back, we were an engineering strength of about 100, odd people. Today we are in a few hundreds, right? And that has primarily happened because of this sort of a differentiation that we've been able to communicate back to that talent pool and have been able to engage with them.
Okay, but what we have seen from some of the talent leaders out there is like talking about scaling teams at unicorns more commonly. So they don't have this runway, as you mentioned, right? It doesn't happen in this. There's no luxury of time to have to implement this particular employee value proposition and communicate that in a sweet amount of time. One has to be very agile and be very quick in terms of propagating that to a large audience. So how do you think that differs on the ground on the ground? Like how do the processes change when you're implementing that?
Yeah, you see, then once you have created your initial set of engineers who build, say, your product, your first set of products, and then the value on that product is largely from a scale standpoint, right? Because you have already built a platform. That platform is working. You have a proof of concept there. That concept has been validated, and that's the reason why you've been able to attract an X amount of valuation of your company, and so you moved in scale, right? Once that is achieved, then it is more about scaling up, and that scale up is where you, like you correctly pointed out, you don't have the luxury of time. So for example, I mean, we kind of always believe that a project that you're running is being run to plan what would be a 10x scale on it, right? And what will be some very short term and a midterm impact on it. So there, the engineering strength you need to build is to be able to get you to that level of scale. And then once you're building that scale, and then you have regular periods where your technology is stressed out or checked out as to how well do you stand during, whether it is your big billion day sale or your flash sale or your, use the platform day and so on. Your engineering strength is virtually tested there, right? Your engineering endurance is tested there, and that sort of a number to be built, then you have no other go but to reach out to a larger talent pool, right? You start engaging with a larger talent pool. You started reinventing some of your selection practices. You look at how do you include them, offering them different sort of assessments, figuring out how do you try and bring them onto the table and have those conversations with them. So like I said, the first set of engineers is always based on, the immediate problems that you need to solve, and then you're talking about the scale business or the story of your company, right? And the impact that you're going to create. Today, an engineer, when he speaks to you, he wants to, like I said, he wants to know more what is the impact that he can create on the table, right? And what is the social impact that it causes in the back end. And that's the reason for him to come and work with you. And as long as you're able to build that story and communicate that to them, then you are able to achieve that scale.